Hi, Marco.
Hello.
What is your disability?
So I have a hearing impairment, which is technically called sensory neural hearing loss, and it's on both ears. And in simpler words, it's a degenerative condition that is making me increasingly deaf. So I was born as a hearing person, but I will never know really what was my hearing condition when I was born, because I never tested before noticing that I had problems with hearing. And so yeah, it just the hearing level in different frequency spectrum just decreases steadily, and it's very hard to predict where it will arrive at the end. So yeah, just live in this limbo, checking yourself every time you see what's happening.
Right, as I understand from what you said, so so it's not like you are losing all frequencies, but you are losing some of them, right? So you didn't.
Well, yeah, I mean, but the process goes through all the frequencies. So if you think about a spectrum from 20 Hz to 20K, at the moment I can hear decently only around 150 Hz. I mean, up to 150 Hz. There I can still hear decently. Yes. Everything after that, it's of course it's a slope that is doing like that.
Yes.
So between 150 Hz and maybe 300, 400, I can hear something. And then from 400, 500 up to the end of the spectrum, I cannot really hear anything unless it's extremely loud.
Good.
So talking about minus 80 dB or something like that.
Good.
So minus 90 dB is normally recognized as profound deafness. So what is commonly known as being deaf.
Good. And
but it's very complicated also to describe, you know. Sorry, I interrupted you. I just wanted to say it's also very difficult to describe because hearing has so many different types of levels and condition and degrees. So even when hearing people talk about deafness, it's most, and I say this because I was also doing it before. It's always in terms, oh yeah, you can be deaf or you can be hearing. Well, that's not, there is a lot in between, and it's a very dynamic field. There is also people who are born deaf, people who are becoming deaf due to a trauma, people who may have a condition like mine that is degenerative, and everybody become at least a bit deaf at some point because of ages. So, you know, this in this sense, it's part of everyone's life, although we don't like to think about it in this way.
got it. And how is this, your disability, how it impacts your creative work?
Well, in many ways, and then there are also as many ways that you learn to cope with it. And again, I'm in a particular position because I was born in the hearing world. So yeah, for me, it's a loss in some senses. But I also learned, especially from other deaf people, especially from people who were born deaf, that it's not necessarily everything a loss. So since a few years now, I started looking also at this condition in that sense. So what I'm actually gaining. Of course, I'm losing something if we compare it to my previous self. But I'm also gaining other ways of understanding sound, other ways of handling sound, and other ways of dealing with people above all.
Yes. Can you just more elaborate on that? What you gain or what you learn due to your discovery?
Well, you learn. I mean, I learned that sound as the hearing world understand it, it is the very normative way of understanding it. Normative in the sense that it is really, how to say, it's really defined by establishing rules, and the rules are established by hearing people. So there is a certain norm that specify what sound is, what it can be, and how it can be understood. But all of this is defined by people who are hearing. Whereas, as I said before, okay, maybe deaf people may be not so many compared to the whole population, but also people with hearing problems, it's everywhere. Every person that I know that makes music have either tinnitus or doesn't hear properly. And so I also don't like to think about non-hearing people as a minority. That's factually not true. Just we hearing people like to think about that. So that's stuff that you learn. And then, I mean, more personally, of course, having a degenerative condition that is making you deaf while you base your career on sound and music, among other things, at first it was a shock. It was just the most profound moment of panic I probably ever had when I was diagnosed this thing. And that's because I was afraid and ignorant of what the whole thing would mean. And I could not imagine how I could keep working while experiencing this degeneration. And so it took me a couple of years to get around it and start to understand that, okay, like your life it's still there. It's not that it's finished or anything. And all the experience that you have working with sound, and especially with acoustics and psychoacoustics, which is one of my expertise, all this stuff, it's still very useful. It's maybe even more useful than it was before. And then it's just about finding your technique to keep working with sound. So of course, also the kind of music that I do has changed, especially in terms of timbre. More trivially, because there are certain frequencies that I don't hear anyway, even with my hearing aids. And that's another very important thing that I learned, how prosthetic technologies for hearing, they actually do not only aid you, but also take away something. The hearing aid only amplify until 6,000 hertz. You know? So that it's not like putting a pair of glasses. So it's not the same. So now, without diverging too much, but yeah, you find your own ways of dealing with sound. You find your own diversified interest in timbre,
Yes.
in acoustics, and so on. And then the third thing, to keep it short, the third thing that I learned is a whole new way of dealing with people and sociability. Especially being an Italian in German, you know, I can speak German fairly well now, but I just can't hear well. especially German, because there are lots of sounds like all these sounds. I don't hear them. The way I learned to pronounce them is by asking people how they would move their mouth and their throats, because I don't hear those sounds. And so this is another thing that I learned, for example. But then also when you are here, and especially in Berlin, when I would ask to repeat to someone, they would immediately understand that I don't speak German. And they would start speaking English to me. So I have to reply again in German saying, hey, I am partly deaf, so you can speak in German, but you have to do it slowly because I can't hear you well. Things like that. I could go on forever, but yeah.
Got it. And you said that you learn a new way how to deal with sounds, right? Can you just a little bit introduce or describe this new way?
Yeah, so I'm still in the process, and I think I will probably never stop being in the process. But that's what I like about sound. Like you cannot stop it, right? So it always find a way to reach a body, not necessarily through the ears. So of course there are the most known way of dealing with sound when you are deaf, which are through vibrations, haptic sensation. That's pretty well known. There are also some commercial technologies like bass that transform music into vibration that you can feel on and into your body. So that's a standard approach. But for me, as someone who makes music, makes sound design, does sound engineering and so on, I think first of all, I needed to reconceptualize my understanding of timbre. And I don't know, for example, if you are mixing or mastering a piece of music, of course, you need to follow the loudness perception curve, right? Because that's what the market says. Now, if you're lucky enough to have a privilege not to having to follow that, then things become interesting. So, for example, I made a composition for musikprotokoll a couple of years ago, where I was exactly playing with the loudness perception curve by utilizing my hearing profiles. And so the composition was interactive. You would experience it with headphones and binaural mixing produced live by a software made by the IEM in Graz. And so I placed on the two sides of the imaginary territory you were exploring with your hand. I put what I would hear on one side without hearing aid, which is mostly low frequencies, as I said. And then on the other hand, I recorded the outputs of the hearing aid. And so you could navigate this space using different techniques of mixing and so on. Then there were also other sources of sound in the space and so on. But the most important thing for me was this. So I made a composition, recorded on my bass and with other effects and stuff. And that becomes a very interesting way of playing with sound, because you are going against those normative criteria of how people expect music or sound to sound. And it becomes very interesting. Now, this could be also very long conversation, but if you think also about how fixed the criteria for commercially released music are, and there is really no reason why that should be that way. I mean, it can be that way. It's nice to have that kind of sound, but you can also experiment with a lot of different potentialities of sound. And I think this also comes back to the fact that for most hearing people, either you are deaf or you are hearing. Like there is no gray zone in between. So it doesn't make sense to master anything else in a different way, because either you hear all of it or you don't. Whether that's completely false. So there is so much in between, as I said, so many different conditions. So you can play with that potential. And yeah, that's something that I'm still learning to do also now in a new project. Maybe we talk about it later. Yeah, that's one of the things.
Right. You said that, and this is very interesting. No idea, right? In fact or observation, right? You said that there is no, okay, so there is no complete hearing, and there is no. So that means that most of us, right, have some hearing problems. And then, from your experience, right, both as composer and music creator and somebody who has a problem with hearing, right? What could be good principles how we can make music, let's say, more expensive, that it could be more experienceable, or let's say, or more hearing for those people who have those problems of hearing.
Yeah, so first of all, I would not even call it a problem, you know, because as I said, like hearing is a fluid condition.
Yes.
It changes day by day. It changes if you spend 4 hours in a plane.
Yes.
You know, it's extremely dynamic, and it also changes across 20 years if you work next to a huge machine.
Yes.
So I will not call it a problem. I will call it a hearing condition. It is a condition that can change, right? Now, condition also has a negative tone to it, but I would use it without that. So I think that's key, especially to your question, because if the moment one stop thinking about hearing problems and just hearing conditions, then in front of you, you don't have a wall that you have to break down somehow, you know, the problem of hearing, but you just have conditions that create a territory. You can navigate the territory. And I think that's the best, for me at least, that's the best first step towards making music that can be experienced in different ways by different people with different hearing conditions.
Yes.
And of course, it's not like you cannot, I think it's incredibly superficial to think, and I'm not saying you say that, but I know other people think that, like make music for deaf people. Like that's not that's not good, you know, like also ethically, that's not a good way of putting it. Yeah, go ahead.
Just let's say I will a little bit correct my question, right?
Sorry?
I will a little bit change my question, okay?
Okay.
And the question is, let's say, if you would like to create music, okay, what are the suggestions for others to create music for you, right? For your conditions, what it could be, right? What are the main principles if somebody would like to compose music for you?
Yeah, again, so I think moving away from the established market criteria of music mastering and music acoustic and so on, that's the first place where to go in that sense. And you want to be creative also in the way you engineer sound, and also backward in the way you compose sound. I don't know, I find, for example, always very inspiring, although he probably had no idea of the kind of conversation we're having now, but the work of Giacinto Scelsi. I find it very inspiring because he was among the first to, as we all know, to work with the material of sound, with the timbre qualities of sound in a compositional way.
Yes.
And I personally find that kind of approach inspiring in this sense too. So if you think about sound as a material that can vibrate bodies, it can vibrate different surfaces, and it can have so many tonalities and microtonalities and so on. And you want to move away from that thing. Oh yeah, I'm gonna have to add this air here. Like most people don't even hear that stuff.
Got it.
You know.
Got it.
It's like
it's no, it corresponds what you said, right? So we have a very, very normative idea what sound is and what it should be, but it doesn't correspond to it at all, right? So different people hear different things, different conditions.
Yeah, and of course, if this is even stronger, the impact of this is even stronger if we realize that right now we are talking about Western ways of making music, experiencing music, and so forth, which means experiencing it with your headphones, experiencing your concert hall, experiencing here and there. But in all the other culture of every other part of the world, that also is different, the way you experience music most of the time. Or so again, I mean, there is a lot to put into question there, and I really appreciate that having a different hearing condition from most people makes you realize all this stuff.
Good.
And
how?
And then I think.
Sorry.
No, I just wanted to say I don't think there is really a recipe for this kind of thing, but what I liked in my process, that is still ongoing, is that of course, I worked for, now it's almost 20 years that I do what I do. And I got my diagnosis about 10 years ago. So in the previous 10 years before the diagnosis, I had my tool set, I have my methodology of working with sound and making music and composing music and playing music. And then it's not that I completely changed everything because of what happened or what I discovered. I just expanded what I had already to take into consideration all this kind of observation. That's why I say I don't think there is really a recipe for it, but just the potential is already there because you are working with sound, and sound is multiple.
Got it. And how, let's say how your how is this disability, right? Let's say, I don't know whether in your way it's called disability, but how this disability affected your career, right? Not your music, it's okay.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I talked over you.
Yes, how it affected your musical career, right? As composer, performer.
Yeah, I mean, apart from all the personal and working methods things that we already mentioned, in terms of career, it didn't really affect it because I had the privilege, the fortune, or whatever you want to call it, to have already achieved something in my career when this switch in my self-identification and my handling of the world of sound happened. So it didn't really affect much that, other than I can tell you that it's actually pushed me to go back to work with sound in a much more attentive and elaborate way. And I need to make a little premise so that this makes sense, because I was born as a sound designer and a musician, and then first 10 years of my career I made performances between sound and gestural music, then mixing performance art and music and sound, and made sound art installation and so on. And then slowly with the performances, I started working more in theater and dance in the latest years. And in those years, while I was still making the music for the pieces, it was not the same focus as I had before on sound. So sound was still there, very important, fundamental to the pieces, but the pieces were much larger and elaborated and complex. So there were also many other things at play. There was robotics, prosthesis, and this and that. So I had moved a little bit away from a certain particular focus on sound. And this process that happened to me with my hearing condition really pushed me to go back to it, to find out more about it somehow.
Can you imagine, let's say, can you imagine the music was more accessible? And if yes, what it could be? And by accessible, I mean accessible for people with various disabilities.
Yeah, again, I think the accessibility issue is, in the public opinion, very badly phrased. So again, like just if you think about the term access,
yes,
it means that something is enclosed and you need to enter it.
Yes, yes.
So the premise is already wrong. Why that thing should be closed and I should have the need to access it thanks to another person.
Yes.
You know. So again, I think your answer is your question is good, but I think we need to answer it by going backward and say things should not be made enclosed in four walls.
Yes.
You would not need a key provided by someone else to access it.
Yes.
It should be already out there, which means, in less abstract words, it means taking into consideration that everything that we said already, that everybody hears in a different way, and yeah, people are disabled, but people are disabled by society, not by their own impairment.
Yes, got it.
At least that's what I think, and many colleagues that are also disabled like me, they also think. I'm not saying it's a majority, but that's also important to keep into consideration. And in that sense, I think what would be very beneficial is to involve deaf people, deaf from birth, hard of hearing people, people with all kinds of conditions, and listen to what they had to say about sound.
Right.
And this is actually the premise of my new project. And it took me a few years to understand how to make a project about deafness, without me being the artist who all of a sudden became deaf and now I want to talk about deafness, but for all his life he was a hearing person.
Yes.
That kind of sucks.
Yes.
And so I had this idea of creating a group with other deaf people from all walks of life and do research with this group about sound, about all the different ways in which they can experience sound. If you are deaf from birth, you don't hear anything almost, but you do have a perception of sound, which is very different from mine or yours, and so on. There is a whole range. So we spent months doing research all together, talking about sort of sound-based phenomenology of deafness, and making diaries, making interviews, and exploring terminologies and sound and technologies as well. As I said, all this in relation to prosthesis, how they actually hide or create gaps in your perception rather than hiding. And now with all this research, I spent 5-6 months doing it. Now I'm be making a new performance that premieres in September, and also an installation and other research material that I will exhibit. And I think this was really constructive as a way of working, because it's kind of decentered me from the situation, and I could learn a lot, and I could share a lot also with the people of the group. And yeah, if there is one way of making music that is not accessible, but rather
more inclusive.
already
Let's say
at
more
hand
inclusive.
for everyone.
Yes, more inclusive.
Already at hand for everyone.
Yes.
Yeah. It's already there. And yeah, I think it's important to be closer to people that are different from you.
Yes. And the last question, right? You talk about yourselves, and you talk about this group and opportunities. But let's talk about new music scene, right? Or a new music role. What it could be? Let's say what you think. What it could be new music role for making this musical landscape more inclusive.
Well, I mean, there are already several projects that handle this question from the purely defined accessibility problem. So, for example, there is Drake Music in the UK. They do a lot of very great work. But again, without nothing to take away from that kind of work, which is very important, again, that work is based on providing accessibility. But people don't need to access things allowed by someone else. I think there is a need to rethink compositional engineering and psychological aspects of music and music making from many different viewpoints. That's what I think is really important.
Thank you very much, Marco. It was brilliant end note.
Thanks for the questions and for your interest.